Good afternoon. My name is David McCallie. I'm a Senior Vice President in Medical Informatics, longtime Cerner associate, and I hope you're here to hear about Smart on FHIR apps for healthcare. And I'll apologize that this is a little bit closer to the application and user side of our work here at Cerner, and maybe a little bit less about the deep technologies and the cool infrastructure talks that you are hearing for the rest of the DevCon, but I'm promised to do a little bit of technology as I go through this. We've got a lot to cover, so I'm going to go pretty quickly, but I'm going to start off with a challenge that I am consistently now hearing when I get engaged in marketing to important clients, large IDNs, and this is an almost verbatim statement from a CEO of a very important and well-known IDN who currently uses one of those other vendors' products, and his quote was, "EHRs are becoming commodity platforms. The winner will be the EHR vendor that provides the best platform for innovation, the most open and the most extensible platform." So if that's a challenge that we have to face in the market, how do we meet it? How do we become the best platform for innovation and the most open platform? So the vision I'm going to present today here is to develop an app store approach that lets innovative clinical apps emerge that can plug and play inside any compliant EHR. The model for this is obvious. Every one of us has something in our pocket that draws many different apps from these well-known app stores. And what I'm going to propose here or describe here is a nascent effort to create a new kind of app store that's based on what's called the SMART platform. And I'll go into a lot more detail in a few minutes about where the SMART platform comes from and what it is. The name SMART is an acronym for that rather unpronounceable string of words, so let's just call it SMART, but you can think of substitutable apps as the kind of essence of it. Smart on FHIR, EHR as open platform. So I think I've introduced the notion that people are beginning to think of EHRs less of as a solution and more of as a platform on top of which solutions can be delivered. And we've kind of always had it that way with our own products because you can add on additional products to complete the solution. But what's changing is that people are now expecting that these add-ons can come from other people besides Cerner. So the EHR platform becomes responsible for these core services. It's the legal record. It has to manage workflow and orders and documentation and things like that. But edge extensions, which encompass both missing functionality from the core platform and new and innovative applications that no one has thought of yet, the same way that your iPhone has apps on it that Apple never dreamed of when they created an app store, these edge extensions will be layered on top of to complete the functionality. And this is not such a far-fetched idea. If you had put this out in front of an audience of informaticists and CIOs and CMIOs 5 or 6 years ago, they might have sort of said, I don't think that's possible. But with the dramatic success of the other App Store models and with the emergence of some new standards, which we'll talk about in a minute, this is now actually not only within reason, I think this is going to happen. And I want Cerner to be at the forefront of it. So what I'm going to cover here, probably too many slides in too little time, but I'll race through them as best I can, is the 3 key technologies that make this possible. The first of those is a new thing from HL7 called FHIR, which is the API. The second are FHIR profiles, which is where the semantic plug-and-play interoperability comes from. And then the third is the SMART platform itself, which is conventions on how to use a web browser or a web app as part of the application. Once I describe those 3 technologies, I'm going to put a sequence diagram up that shows how they relate to each other, how the flow goes back and forth. Then I'm going to show you some screenshots from some proof points that we did at HIMSS in April, whenever it was. And then we'll end up with some discussions about the things that might go wrong, the open issues. I doubt if we'll have time for Q&A, but hopefully we will. I'll hang around. This is infographic that we put out at HIMSS. We gave this out at our booth, the Cerner booth. and it reflects what we pulled off for the demo there. And I'm going to come back to these particular apps, but we had 6 different apps from 3 different sources, 4 sources, that were plugged into 4 different container systems. Cerner as an EHR, Intermountain as a legacy EHR, and then Harris and Hewlett-Packard put wrappers around the VA's Vista EHR. And those 4 vendors, these 6 app providers, and we had them all working inside Millennium and inside these other vendors' products at HIMSS in April. And it was quite successful. Tremendous positive feedback from the community when we showed this, including officials from ONC and others who were really pretty dazzled by the potential. How do we make it work? Here's how. Start with FHIR. FHIR is a RESTful API. It comes from HL7, and it stands for Fast Health Interoperability Resource. I like to say that it keeps the good parts of HL7 and gets rid of the cruft. Any of you who have dealt with HL7 v3 know what I'm talking about, and the uptake inside HL7's community when FHIR was first put forward has been astonishing. It's the fastest growing, most exciting thing that's ever happened in HL7. There's the logo. RESTful APIs, in this audience, probably most of you know what that means. Most of the people I present this to don't know what it means. I'll just summarize it to say that it focuses on resources and the nouns rather than remote procedure calls, the verbs. So it defines the simple set of activities, get, put, delete, post, that anybody who does web development is familiar with. And it defines those in terms of the core resources that make up a medical record or clinical data. It's very easy for developers to grok. They can read the document and start writing code in a few hours, unlike previous HL7. And these FHIR resources are the key. The resources are valuable if they actually describe stuff we care about and want to move back and forth across these API boundaries. The good news is that the HL7 community has defined a large and growing number of resources. So every one of these categories has a little snippet of XML or JSON that's defined to capture 80% of the use cases for that particular snippet of information. The 80-20 rule is used here to keep these things from growing to be so huge that no one can manage them. And I'll describe in a few minutes what you do if what you need isn't included in the 80%. But suffice it to say that the common stuff is in these resources. I've highlighted the ones in blue that'll be easily familiar to you. Problems, medications, patients, encounters, allergies. But over time, they all become important. Now, what does it look like to fetch a FHIR-defined resource? So here's the URL that would be issued. Some service, in this case openapi.fhir.me, which is a service run by some developers at Boston Children's. Then the name of the resource that you're fetching, in this case an observation. In Cerner world that would be a clinical event, and in the FHIR world they're called observations. And then the identifier. And here's what comes back. It's kind of small print, you probably can't see it out there, but I'll step through a few key aspects of it. The resource type, observation. If I was querying for a patient, I'd put patient. If I was querying for an encounter, I'd put encounter. Pretty simple. The resource unique ID, that's got to be globally unique within the space, within the namespace of this URL. There are semantics that come back with the resource that tells you how to interpret the clinical value. And in this case, the resource contains a link back to the patient that this systolic blood pressure describes. Now you'll notice that I got straight to the blood pressure without going through the patient first. Presumably I had some other way of knowing the patient that was connected to this resource, and I'll show you how you do that in a minute. But taken together, these resources, slide's not in the sequence I've remembered. How do you fetch these resources? I showed you one where you fetch it by the ID, so the parameter there, ID equals 23. An equivalent way is to actually just use a simple URL. This will work only for the identifier, the named identifier. You can also fetch with various query parameters. In this case, fetch me any patient whose name contains the string EVE. I could also constrain it to fetch any patient whose gender text field, in the JSON structure that'd be gender.text if you're nesting downward, contains the string MALE, or more likely I would actually do that query by specifying a code value so that I could be sure not to get female in addition to male, because MALE actually is in the middle of FEMALE. So if you really want to get just males, you would query by a code set. And that funny looking string there is the URI, the Uniform Reference Indicator, for the code set that is typically used to code administrative gender. I can also fetch using FHIR with things like complex textual queries, bone or liver and metastases. And then I can fetch in a more typical way by essentially cascading. So you see here I'm constraining to patient 23 and then fetching the procedures between these two dates, constrained to patient 23. All sorts of different ways to slice and dice grabbing the data that you want. Now, a system that implements FHIR doesn't have to build out every one of these query capabilities, but you have to declare what kinds of queries you support using a profile, which we'll talk about in a minute. So those of you who might be in a position to actually write Cerner services to support FHIR API, you may be getting heartburn looking at some of these query types and say, wait a minute, our backend doesn't support a query like that. So don't panic. You only have to support it if you need it. Now, if you take these resources all together and consider the URLs and the relative URLs to be pointers, you've effectively constructed a graph of interesting information about your patient. So in this case, this is a diagnostic report that has pointers to the practitioners, that's in our world providers or clinicians, the organizations, devices, patients, and the observations that are linked therein. Now, FHIR profiles. All those resources are great. The problem is the way they come off the specifications page at HL7, they're unconstrained. So it's a list of attributes, and there's no constraint as to whether the attribute is required but only one, required but many, not required, and so forth. So what profiles do is layered on top of the FHIR resources, and they constrain the cardinality of each attribute. They specify the value sets or the nomenclature for coded fields. And most importantly, or very importantly, they specify if you have a complex piece of data that requires multiple resources to describe it, how those resources are linked together to describe the higher level entity. And I'm going to give you an example in a second in detail about what on the surface would seem fairly simple, describing a blood pressure, but which turns out to be remarkably hard. And any of you who have worked with Cerner's clinical event model and tried to figure out how to match up systolic and diastolic blood pressures know what I'm talking about. It's tricky. The FHIR profiles can also define those extensions that I described. If the off-the-shelf resource doesn't contain something that you need, you can write an extension. For example, the off-the-shelf patient resource from HL7 does not include ethnicity. But in the US, that's a field that's required for certain kinds of reporting, so that's a common extension for US patient implementations, the profiles for the patient resource. Now, the profiles, the reason I put so much time into them is they are what enables plug and play. It's one thing to have an API that everybody agrees upon, but if when you move the data back and forth you can't understand that data, you really haven't achieved a whole lot of good. The profile describes enough detail about the data that's moving that you have what I call semantics by contract. Now, the great vision of informaticists in the last decade was computable semantics, and that's why we had reference information models and all sorts of things that would get passed along with the data. And in theory, the receiving system could look at all the reference models and say, I can figure out what you meant by just sheer logic. It didn't work. It was a dismal failure. So semantics by contract, which is what a profile gives you, is not nearly as elegant. It's not going to generate any PhDs, but I think it will make systems that can actually work. And in the FHIR, the smart on FHIR world that I'm proposing, we would develop a set of profiles that are for use in the use case of smart on FHIR. Now, there can be more than one profile for a resource depending upon your needs. Now, here's what a blood pressure might look like, mapped out as three related observations. The high-level observation is the grouper in Cerner world terms. That's the combined patient blood pressure. That grouper has in it pointers to two independent observations, one of which captures the systolic blood pressure and one of which captures the diastolic blood pressure. And you can see in both cases, or in all three cases, there are LOINC codes specifying exactly what it is you've got. I think I left, oh, and here's the LOINC code. So that's the LOINC code for the combined, and this is the systolic, and this is the diastolic. You have to get to that degree of specificity if you want systems to plug and play. Interestingly enough, FHIR is a draft standard. In the course of its initial proposal to its current DSTU status, which is its first version as a draft standard, they've changed this 3 times. So this has to be specified, because even the people that are designing the FHIR have realized they didn't get it right the first 2 times. So that's where the profiles are so critical. Now, you might say, oh my goodness, in order to get a blood pressure, I have to do 3 different queries, once for the parent, and then once for the systolic, and once for the diastolic. Oh my gosh, that's not going to work. Here's what that query would look like, and the little magic trick is this parameter that says include the relative the related targets. So what you get back when you issue the query is not a single resource in this case. You get back an atom feed that includes the high-level parent blood pressure. It includes the nested systolic blood pressure, the nested diastolic blood pressure, and a denormalization, if you would, or copy of the patient resource. And in addition, it gives you the URLs internally to reassemble this graph in memory in your app, and it gives you links, as do all atom feeds, to go get the next batch of data. So this is an inherently what I would call a continuable query. It might fetch back, say, 25 blood pressures for this patient, and if you want more, it'll give you a link that says, if you click this link, or if you issue this GET against that link, you'll get the next 25. Now that puts big burdens on those of us who implement systems, because that link has to manage enough state so that you can figure out where you left off, and you return the next 25 instead of the previous 25. Now, how do we get profiles? This is the politically challenging business and politically challenging part. How do we get widespread adoption of these profiles? Well, first off, you got to start with credible profiles, and then you got to get the vendor community to agree these make sense. The good news is that we have work done at Intermountain that we now have access to because of our relationship, our close relationship with Intermountain, where they've developed over the last several decades something they call clinical element models. And it turns out their catalog of 6,500 or so clinical element models are essentially profiles. So our plan is to take those clinical element models and to work with a broader vendor community, not just Cerner, but other vendors who are interested in this project with us, to turn them into FHIR profiles and then to extend them as necessary. So we have a good plan and we have a good start with the clinical models. Check back with me in 6 months and I'll tell you whether we're getting some adoption of this or not. Now, the profiles have to refer coded values to code sets or to nomenclatures. If you had given this challenge to the informatics community, let's say 6 or 7 years ago, before high tech and before meaningful use, there would have been collective groans in the room, because coming up with an agreement on what nomenclatures should describe these common things in clinical medicine has been incredibly tedious, controversial, conflicted, and whatever. But the good news is that the $22 billion of meaningful use, even if it may not have bought us a whole lot else, it did buy us consensus on what the right nomenclatures are for most of the core terms of clinical medicine. So problems and conditions are in SNOMED, medications are in RxNorm. Finally, that's a good enough nomenclature to mean you don't have to use a vendor specific like Multum or FDB. Observations, lab values, blood pressures are in LOINC. Code sets are most of them captured in an HL7 standard code set, and so forth. Now, this is not to say that the problems are all solved. There's very complex, detailed, structured data about history and physical exam that really hasn't been addressed yet, and we'll have to solve that problem as we go forward. Now, the final, that's leg number 1, leg number 2, FHIR profiles. Leg number 3 are the smart platform itself, the smart apps, the web app specification. These are the things we actually demonstrated at HIMSS. You can see here some screenshots I'll show you in more detail in a few minutes. It stands for Substitutable Medical Apps. It was initially proposed by 2 professors at Harvard Medical School in 2009. They, on the basis of that article in the New England Journal of Medicine, got a major grant from ONC, and they fleshed out the models in the last couple of years. I was privileged to be an advisor to their group representing the vendor community, so it enabled me to keep track of what they were doing. Initially, I was skeptical and said, you guys are never going to succeed. Nice idea. No one will care. Now I've become a believer. A smart app is nothing but a web app. It has some conventions or some specifications that tell you what subset of HTML, basically HTML5, and how to use JavaScript. That web app is embedded in the EHR in an ideal scenario. In Cerner's world, that's an M page. So M page is the container into which we embed the smart apps. In fact, a smart app is nothing but a special case of M page. And then there's some conventions on how you launch this app with a URL that contains enough information for the app to know how to talk to the data source that's specified by the FHIR service available from that EHR. So the URL typically will have the address of the app itself, obviously, and then one of the parameters will be something about who the patient is and who the provider is. I'm just calling that EHR context. And then another parameter will be where's the data? How do I get to the data? Where's the FHIR service endpoint? The data access occurs through FHIR, obviously. If you go to the smart website, don't be confused because their original design was based on RDF to move data back and forth. They've since shifted to FHIR, but the website isn't completely switched over. So there are parts of it that still talk about RDF. RDF would have been a good choice, but HL7 went with this RESTful FHIR model, which is going to have much more acceptance than an RDF model. And then OAuth 2 is the security model that's being fleshed out. Most of Cerner's work was with OAuth 1. This is OAuth 2, which is a little bit of an issue for us. Now, here's a sequence diagram that hopefully will capture these interactions. So the swim lanes here on the far left, let's see, yeah, your left, is Millennium and an M page that sits inside Millennium. In the middle is the smart app. Might be hosted locally inside our data center. Could be, if it's a trusted app, outside on the internet somewhere. And then second from the end is the authentication service, and then the FHIR service itself. Now, typically the authentication service and the FHIR service would be exposed by, in our case, Millennium, but in order to avoid having to have a 3D wrap of these sequence arrows, I just push them off to the right. So you'll see how that works in a second here. So the first thing that happens is the app gets launched, and the simple way to launch an app is to click on a menu choice in PowerChart. The ones we did at HIMSS were done this way, but there's no reason why an app couldn't also be launched by Discern or any other kind of triggering mechanism that the vendor's EHR supports. So Discern could FHIR, based on some condition, open a window and launch the app so that that app is now in the window. So for all practical purposes, Discern clicked the link for you. Now, the app URL contains the EHR's context. Typically, that's the patient, provider, and organization, and it contains the address of the authorization and FHIR services. You can think of those as the URLs for the FHIR service and for the authorization service. So step 2 is the app, now in possession of that knowledge, turns around and asks the authorization service for permission to access this patient's record. The authorization service then that's all part of OAuth. The authorization service then privately makes an assessment that it's okay or not okay, or that the privileges requested are sufficient or not sufficient. And I've got those as dotted lines here going back to Millennium, where the authorization service has to have a Millennium-specific, vendor-specific negotiation to say, yes, I'll give you a key, or no, I won't. In this case, let's assume they do. The authorization service says you're in. It hands back an authorization token, which is a secret key, back to the smart app. The next step is the app. Now, it hasn't put up a web page yet for the user. This is all still happening in the click processing. The smart app typically will then take that key, the token, and make a FHIR request to the FHIR service, probably in our case hosted by Millennium, to get some information to fill out that initial page. So what it's typically going to do is get the patient. It might also get something about the provider, the organization, the encounter. It might even go ahead and get a lot of data about the patient if it knows that on that first page you want to throw up a lot of data. So that first conversation is up to the app. But since they have access to the full set of FHIR services, the app can do whatever it needs. It doesn't have to be pre-negotiated by anybody. You just issue the queries that you need to. And then the app returns the HTML to the M page, which is just an Internet Explorer embedded browser, which displays it to the clinician. So from the clinician's perspective, they clicked a link, some wheels turned in the background, and a web page shows up that understands who they are, who the patient is, and gives them something interesting to do. Then subsequent interactions between the clinician and the app are just like using any web app. Information is captured by the HTML and JavaScript. It's posted to the web server. The web server does additional fetches of additional patient data as necessary, puts that back on the screen. You repeat that process until the app is finished, and then you're done. So hopefully that makes sense as a high level for sort of the sequence of how these things interrelate to each other. There's nothing out of the ordinary about this. This is the standard way OAuth 2 based remote services get proxy authorization to do their work. What's cool about it is it's a clean separation between the data access channel, which is FHIR, and the visual experience, which is HTML. Those two are cleanly separated, which means this model would work equally well for a mobile app. And all you would do is that instead of those two left-hand columns being Cerner, Millennium, it would be a mobile app, and the FHIR service would point to whatever data store the mobile app needs access to. Could be the patient's portal, could be Millennium, could be Healthy Intent, could be Population Health Services, whatever. Now there's one variation of this that's actually quite common, which is the app itself issues the FHIR calls from within the browser instead of doing an HTML back to the web server and then having the web server do the query. So if you're a node type and you believe in kind of JavaScript-driven apps as opposed to web server-driven apps, then the model works exactly the same way. And the call to the FHIR service is just an AJAX call from the JavaScript running inside the browser embedded in Millennium sitting on the desktop. This is how actually most of them are actually being written, probably. Now, obviously, this is very similar to other things we do at Cerner, in particular to MPages, which, MPages, as most of you know, has blazed the trail for us here in terms of creating extensions driven by both Cerner teams as well as client teams, and even in a few cases, some third-party companies. The downside of MPages, and I use this in quote, the limitations is a better way, is that it's a proprietary approach. So an app vendor that wants to build for MPages is not building for anybody other than Cerner. Now that may be sufficient for some app vendors, but we think a broader community will emerge if there's a more open, standards-based way to invoke these services. MPages doesn't use OAuth 2 at the moment. And because it grew up around sort of ad hoc needs driven by CCL and the services didn't always exist, it oftentimes, many of our MPages aren't using back-end services. CareAware Services is very similar to FHIR in that it supports RESTful APIs, but it also has mixed in with it a number of RPC services, which is not strictly speaking part of the FHIR standard. There's some debate about how to add that, but at the moment you can't call that part of the standard. And maybe most importantly is there isn't a concept like the FHIR profiles in the CareAware services, so they tend to return the data in terms of whatever the local hospital's coded values are, which means that a CareAware service at Hospital A is going to return different codes than a CareAware service running at Hospital B. And that obviously limits the users who would want to build plug-and-play apps. And it likewise is considered Cerner proprietary, although it's open in the sense that we let all of our clients purchase it and use it. So much work to leverage in building out Smart on FHIR on top of MPages and leveraging the CareAware framework, but I hope you can see that there's some of the differences there. So let me talk a little bit about the apps that we showed at at HIMSS here. I'm just come back and remind you here. These are the vendors. Each of the 4 vendors showed this set of apps, and we were using FHIR services. We just made up some simple profiles because we didn't have time to do formal profiles. So it was very lightweight and simple approach that was clearly demonstration purposes, but it actually worked flawlessly. Many thanks to a number of you who we tapped on the shoulder at the last minute to get this pulled together. So one of the things that I heard about in the previous talk was this notion of micro interactions. And I would say that one of the things that makes apps, smart apps, attractive is that they are optimized around these micro interactions, and I'll try to show you that. They don't have to be, but the ones that we picked are. So in this case, here's the built-in growth chart that ships as part of Cerner's PowerChart. Straightforward, clinicians can use it. It's kind of confusing if you're not a clinician. So the SMART team built a visually much more sophisticated equivalent view. This pulls the exact same patient data out of Millennium, but it wraps it in a much more sophisticated visual experience. But much more importantly than the fact that this is prettier, it also includes a view of that same data that is tailored for the parents of the child, not for the clinician. So this is a little bit of micro optimization of the user experience. And in this case, it lets the child's weight be symbolized with an icon instead of a graph point on a curve. And it shows the child's height silhouetted against the mother and the father's height, so that the parents get a sense of how the child is growing compared to where they ought to be. Very cool. When I show this to our pediatrics team, they say, I wish we had the resources to go build that. That's something we'd really like to do. But that's why we have apps. Okay, a similar situation. This is developed at Boston Children's, and it's a simple display of pediatric blood pressures, but what's different about it is that when you hover over the color coding of abnormality, it gives you an explanation as to why, for this particular height and weight of the child, this blood pressure is abnormal, even though in a larger child, it might be completely normal. And what our doctors have to do in Millennium today is look up the blood pressure on the screen and then consult a nomogram in a textbook or taped to the wall to see if the blood pressure is abnormal for us. What is this, a 7-year-old, 125 centimeter child. With this simple little app, which probably is no more than a few hundred lines of code, that problem goes away. Another kind of micro optimization. Here's a case of a client-authored app. This is called Evidentia, and it was built by the informatics team at Mayo, and they're going to spin it out as a commercial product. And what Evidentia does is when you launch the app, it pulls the documents for the current encounter out of Millennium before it opens the page, and then it puts the page up of the current documents. You pick one of the documents, and you can read the document just like you could within Millennium, and you'd say, okay, why would you do that? We've already got a way to read documents. Well, the reason is because they parse the document for medically interesting concepts, and then they offer for the clinician a heavily curated set of links to the best evidence for the management of that clinical condition. So it's a highly customized, highly optimized reference tool that is linked to the current patient and the current patient's documents. It's a pretty cool idea. It's not technically all that sophisticated, but building that curated list of documents takes a place like the Mayo Clinic to do it. That's not something that's going to get done in the Cerner content group, at least probably not. Second thing it does is it allows the physician to email what they call an information prescription to the patient through the portal about the condition. So in addition to giving the physician something deep to chew on, it gives the physician something that they can email to the patient through the portal. Now, the demo that we did at HIMSS, we didn't hook it into our portal, but it would be pretty straightforward to basically have the right mouse click, say, send to the patient, have it essentially push to the queue of documents waiting for the patient at the patient portal. Here's another app that came from Intermountain. Very simple one-screen app that displays the patient's bilirubin. This is in a newborn. And some of you know that when newborns emerge, they may not have the liver up to speed yet in processing the blood breakdown products that accompany the birth process. And if they don't, they can get mental retardation from something called kernicterus. And the treatment is simple. You have to put the patient under ultraviolet lights for a few hours, and that actually triggers off enzymes in the skin that break down the hemoglobin. It's a super simple way to prevent a devastating problem. But if you don't know that your patient needs to be under those lights, you're essentially committing malpractice. So Intermountain built this simple display, hooked it up to a little trigger that when that lab value comes in, it pops it up and shows the doctor exactly where that patient sits on the need to be treated or not. And if they do need to be treated, then you can track that to completion to make sure that you've gone far enough to remove them from the UV therapy. They've driven the incidence of kernicterus to 0 at Intermountain by using simple techniques like this. Highly focused, micro-optimized. Meducation is another app, the third-party company called Polyglot. It's optimized for medication handout information for patients who don't speak English. The app pulls in the med profile for the patient when it first launches. You pick a particular drug and you get a drug handout, simplified information with icons that indicate when you take the drug and when you don't take it. But more interestingly, a list of 17 languages that they've translated these into. And in this case, I selected Korean, and you get that drug information in Korean. Now, Multum supports English and Spanish. I don't know that we've gone past English and Spanish, but I can be pretty sure we're not going to get to Korean anytime soon. But somebody's written an app that gets us there. And then an interesting product called VisualDX, which is a tool, another decision support tool, reference information that's optimized to help physicians take care of skin lesions. In this case, and actually any visual diagnosis, that's the name VisualDX. It started out as skin lesions, but it also includes radiographic findings and the like. The app starts by launching and fetching the medications and the problems out of the patient's record so that the clinician can see if the disease that the patient has matches what they're finding on the patient's body without having to type anything in. So this is a little shortcut that gets you into that app and gets you useful information more quickly. In this case, I believe the patient has Legionnaire's disease, and you click on that and you get the app comes back now with the diagnostic information to help you interpret whether what you're seeing on the chest x-ray matches the patient that you have in front of you. This is an app that we have actually deployed via the standard M-Page model, but since it was too complicated to figure out how to query the diagnosis and the drug information from every Cerner client without a common nomenclature in place, when we deploy it via the M-Page model, the clinician has to type it in. And it's not a big deal, and it's a useful app, and the clinicians like it. But that one little trick of fetching that data using the FHIR service makes the app that much quicker and easier to launch. So what kind of apps might appear? Clearly, you've seen some examples here of decision support, where we have complex or evolving logic and complex visualizations, things that can't be captured in a simple static discern rule or an order set. Patient-provider data sharing. I've given you a couple of examples of where there's two views of the same data, one optimized for the doctor, one optimized for the patient. That, I think, will become an increasingly common metaphor. Mobile health applications, where it's a handheld device, smartphone, that's using these FHIR services and those profiles, I think we'll find to be very powerful. And then it can work the other direction, and the app can actually bring patient data into the workflow, like from the population health cloud down into the vendor's EHR. This is how we'll push healthy intent out to non-Cerner EHRs in places like Chicago. And then this platform is also a good way to deploy national scale services like some of the genomics work that Dr. Nolan described earlier in the morning, where you want it to feel like it's a part of the EMR, even though the data itself lives completely in the cloud. What could stop this? What could go wrong? FHIR is unproven. There's lots to learn about how well it works at scale. FHIR doesn't have transaction support. That is probably going to be a concern in the long run. And even though you could combine FHIR services to give you a SOA-like model, it doesn't have an official service-oriented architecture support, although there's some debate about how to add that in. Will vendors take their existing proprietary APIs, and most of the vendors have something equivalent to CareAware services, and support FHIR on top of that? We don't know. We hope so, we don't know. Will vendors adopt the profiles and the inherent mapping that's necessary to make the profiles speak standard on the outside, map to the local codes on the inside? That's a lot of work. Any of you involved with mapping know how much that is, how much work that is. And will these app ecosystems emerge? Will there be app stores? My guess is there'll be a Cerner app store, and there might be an Allscripts app store. I don't know if we'll see a EHR health app store that merges across vendors. In some ways, really don't care as long as there's a robust market out there. What kind of apps will our clients allow to run? You can be pretty sure they're not going to let the doctors just point to any old app out there and fire it off, because that app could be an app that just sucks data out and sells it overseas for for money. And then if the apps are all coming from different creators, what's going to happen to usability and color schemes and things like that? Do we need standards for usability of the apps? So I'm ending with 6 seconds to spare, and I'll stop there. Thank you.